I made a course 3 years ago called React 2025, and we're gonna take a look at what's changed in the last 3 years, what things I would do the same, and what things I would change. So first off, there was a course. Yes, there was a course. It was called React 2025. It still exists. You can still watch it. The goal was to help you build full stack applications, real applications that hooked up to a database. You could do payments, the whole shebang, right? Part of the genesis for the course was essentially my pitch on it was building full stack apps or modern web apps was pretty difficult. You know, this was 3 years ago. It's got a lot better since then. Really the value I was trying to sell here is you want to spend time writing product code. You want to spend less time kind of stitching together all these different things. You just want to actually build the thing that customers are going to be paying you money for, right? And also, I really wanted to help folks, especially in the front-end developer, mindset or workflow, help graduate them into the full stack. And that was something that I was also, I'd also been on that journey myself before. And when I started to do a lot of that full stack work, especially with tools like Next.js, it really changed how fast I was able to build applications. And I wanted to bring that to more people. That was another big goal. So something I did differently was I actually live streamed the entire course, kind of meta that we're here now talking about this. But I broke it down into a bunch of different videos that walk through building this SaaS application using Next.js, Firebase, React, subscription payments with Stripe, and deployed to Vercel. And that was kind of the stack I picked at the time I was pretty happy with to kind of build along with. And the product that we built was this thing called Fast Feedback. And the idea essentially was to make it really easy to embed these comments on any site, regardless of the tech that you were using. So you could statically generate these pages essentially as, it's just good old fashioned HTML. And then you can embed that in any page to add comments to your blog or to your product review site or really anything that you wanted. That was the genesis of this course. That was really the idea I had for how to teach people about these concepts, but in a way that was applicable to real applications. I didn't want to just go through the motions of, well, here's how this Next.js feature works, or here's how this thing works. I was like, let's actually build something with it. Let's build a real app. And that's what we did. And it was fantastic. I'm so happy for everyone who took the course and gave me tons of good feedback and told me about how it helped transform their coding journey. It was really a humbling and awesome thing to see. And I want to talk about it 3 years later now down the road. So that was the course. A small meta note before we get into it that's a little bit interesting, but video courses are tricky and interesting because it is quite literally a point in time. You don't go back and edit the video, right? This is something where you have to be really careful about how you encode things into a video that's going to be there for 3, 4, 5 years later, because really your only option is to essentially refilm the entire video, right? That's the only thing you can do otherwise like updating the written portion of it. So there's this balance between, do I want evergreen content that's gonna be around for 10 years? Like I wanna teach how JavaScript works, right? Or do I wanna talk about the point in time topics that are really hot right now that I think are gonna make a big impact on someone's career? And I kind of chose a little bit more of the latter because I wanted to talk about Next.js, which has changed a lot in 3 years, and React, which actually has also came out with some new stuff in the last 3 years as well too. So small meta note on courses. So let's first talk about databases. I think that was kind of the core fundamental piece of what I wanted to build this course on was I have a place that I'm storing data. I really need to understand this so that I can transform away from working on just the front end and kind of into the full stack. So the choice I made at the time was Firebase. Now, Firebase, for those of you who have used it before or not used it before, it's been around for a while actually. And overall, I'm still pretty happy with the choice to use Firebase. 3 years later, it has held up really well. I haven't had to do anything. It's basically just been on and running for 3 years with no updates or maintenance on my side. And I haven't had to have any issues with exceeding the tier I was on or things getting taken down. It's kind of just worked. And I'm really happy with that. But the interesting part, or the more meta part, is that the market has actually evolved quite a bit in the last 3 years. So we went from Firebase was really at the time a very, very good choice for doing quote unquote NoSQL, but document-based databases that allowed you just to take an object essentially and put it in the cloud somewhere in storage, right? Well, in the last 3 years, we've seen a complete innovation all across the database and backend market. And I think there are a ton of really, really good tools today, more than I can even name right now. I'm curious what y'all use if you want to drop it in the comments. But there's, Supabase, which is essentially a newer version of Firebase that's open source. There's PlanetScale, which is essentially a better SQL database. There's one cool thing that we've been working on is this edge data latency tool that allows you to kind of pick some different databases, and then you can see, how fast they run when queried from different regions or how you want to query them. So just in here, we have GraphBase, Shopify, Zata, Upstash for Redis. Like there's a bunch of really cool solutions that have been born in the last few years that make it easier than ever really to store data at the edge or in a, it can be distributed around the world or it could be in a single region, but you kind of have that flexibility and they make it really easy. Yeah, I see Prisma and Railway is another really great combination. There's just so many great options now that when I go back and I look at Firebase, I'm still really happy with Firebase, but would I pick it again today? I think the answer is maybe no. But the caveat is if you're already proficient with Firebase, like if I have this app, this fast feedback app running in production, I'm not necessarily going to refactor off of Firebase just because there's new tools today. Because like I said, it's been working actually really well. I haven't really had to do anything for the last couple of years and it's just up and running. So if it's working for you, I think that's fantastic. But starting from complete scratch today, I might take a look at some of those other database backend solutions that exist in the market and just try them out. Maybe I want to go into full Postgres, or maybe I want to go into full MySQL. Maybe I do want to stick with a document database. I have that flexibility really to move things around a little bit. So that's really databases as a whole. Overall, I'm pretty happy with Firebase, but the interesting thing is that the database pairs really closely with the auth solution that you use. So what I ended up choosing for the course was Firebase Auth. And actually, just to have up in the background kind of as I'm talking about this, I'll pull up some of the code for Firebase Auth. So all the code for this is open source. You can go check it out. The repo is called Fast Feedback. Inside of the library folder, I have this auth file. And let's see, I think I can collapse this. I'll make this a little bit bigger. What you'll notice with Firebase Auth, and I think, honestly, a lot of the auth solutions, even 3 years ago, is that you were either building for a decoupled backend that was like an Express server somewhere, and that was how you were building your auth, or you were building completely client-side only auth. And I guess what I mean by that is if I go back over to the application here, I'm checking the auth on the client side when the client side JavaScript has loaded. So initially I'm seeing some loading state and then I'm checking to see if I'm authenticated. If I'm not authenticated, then I would get redirected out. So just to paint that picture here, let's say I'm on the home page and I continue with Google here. We're going to log in with my account. It's checking that auth on the client side. And now when I go to the dashboard, I actually am able to load the sites for my user. Now, this isn't necessarily bad. There's nothing necessarily wrong with doing auth on the client side, especially if you're building dashboards. But to be fair, at the time, this was mostly the way I saw most people building React applications. There was a lot of people building React apps on the client side. Now, fast forwarding 3 years to today, there's a little bit more of a breakdown between where I'm doing auth on the server or on the client. And let's talk about that a little bit because I think it's a little bit confusing. So if we look at our code for fast feedback, I'm using context to make this auth context. Essentially, it's wrapping React context. And then inside of here, I have some state. What is the user and are we loading the user? We have some functions down below that I call in various places throughout the application. There's sign in with email, sign in with GitHub, sign in with Google. And all these are doing is basically just a wrapper around the Firebase client-side JavaScript SDK. So we can do auth.sign in with whatever, GitHub, Google. They have a bunch of different providers, right? We get the response, we get the user, and we store it in React state. So what that means is I'm only accessing the properties of the user on the client side. So if I wanted to do a server-side check to determine if this page is authenticated, if I want to actually show this to a user, I'm kind of hacking around it a little bit by setting a cookie essentially that says that I have auth. And if that auth cookie is set, then when I load my application, I'm checking with a small snippet of JS that if it is set, just redirect directly to the dashboard. Now this is okay, but it's a little limiting. You're still relying mostly on client-side authentication. Today, if I was to do this again, I would probably evaluate using NextAuth. Let me just pull this up. So NextAuth is an open source solution for authentication for Next.js, but it's also evolving to work for other libraries as well, like Svelte, Solid, Remix, whatever you want, whatever you want to use. But the nice thing about NextAuth is that it makes it really easy to add auth into a Next.js application that just didn't really exist at the time. So just to put it into perspective here, let's do a little bit of a before and after, and we'll talk about some of the trade-offs here in picking auth. So let me pull up what I have here is I have a rebuilt essentially version of fast feedback that is working in the app directory and using some of the newer solutions that I'm going to explore and talk about today. And what's really interesting about this is NextAuth is going to make it really easy for me as a Next.js developer here to do auth checks on the client side, on the server side, in middleware, which we can talk about. And really anywhere I want to look at auth, it's going to give you these really easy helpers to do that. And the way you set it up is you can either use email password, you can use any Google, GitHub auth provider that you want in a similar vein to Firebase auth, but the way that you write the code is a lot more concise and simple. And part of the reason for that is it's native to Next.js. And what I mean by that is if you look at the file name, it's using this catch-all route and it's in the API directory. Now this might change a little bit in the app directory, but at least for right now, in the pages directory, you have this API folder, auth folder, and then you're able to generate multiple routes through one file. So this is a really cool integration point into Next.js. Essentially, Next.js is able to create, log in, log out, all these different API routes from one file by integrating in with NextAuth. So it saves you from having to write a lot of boilerplate to connect up authentication in your application. And then what's really cool is, for example, let's say I'm in my root layout that wraps my entire application. I now have these really, really helpful functions that allow me to do my auth checks on the server side. Now, I know this says unstable, but I'm pretty sure it's going to be stable soon. But it essentially allows you to just fetch and get your user state on the server inside of a server component. We'll talk more about this later. But get that value back and then be able to use it. So you don't have to do the client-side checks essentially to determine whether a user is logged in. Now, I think the big caveat to that is that server-side auth isn't always 100% better. There might be cases where you still want to do client-side, but it's nice to have the option. And I actually revisited this just to check it out. I was trying to rebuild this with Firebase auth in 2023 and just kind of see what it was working with. And I was really struggling. Maybe it was just me, honestly, but I'll just show you where I was at. I was trying to figure this out because I know that Firebase auth, well, first off, in Firebase 9, they essentially refactored the whole thing that allows it to be a lot more modular. So the bundle size isn't as big. It's not one big bundle. So it's a little bit different, but I can set up auth. And apparently what you can do is you can still do all of the client-side stuff like sign in with a pop-up and use a Google Auth provider. But then what I think you're supposed to do is essentially get that user and then you handle the session management yourself. So you have to create multiple API routes to actually take that user value, save it to an HTTP only cookie, and then also be able to fetch that cookie when you're inside of middleware or inside of a server page. So really what NextAuth is doing here is just skipping so you don't have to write all that code yourself, right? It's a similar intention. It's just less user code that you need to write. And I haven't tested this out, but I think with the Firestore adapter, what it can do is then also make sure that when a new user is created, it's also persisted back to your Firestore database of all of your users. So I guess to wrap this one up, for auth, today, if I was building an application, I would probably use NextAuth, aka Auth.js now, and I would probably do my auth checks on the server, either authentication for my entire application in middleware, or for a specific page by just checking on that page if the user was logged in, which ties really well into the next point, rendering and data fetching, because when you're doing that auth check on the server, you might have noticed something that looked a little bit unfamiliar, and that was a asynchronous component. With async components, there are new patterns essentially in Next.js and in React that make it way easier to query data. So for example, if I go back to the layout, you might have noticed that this function is essentially marked as an async function. And then I have some await here that's awaiting some promise. This could be essentially anything I want. This could be query to my database. This could be checking auth. Any promise here, I'm able to await the results. And then once I get back that session, I'm able to get the user from it and forward it along to my nav bar. Now my nav bar in this instance is a client component. So doing my data fetching in the server component, doing my interactivity in my client component, and it's marked by this use client at the top. And the reason it's a client component is because I have a couple different buttons here that allow me to basically click a button and choose if I want to log in or log out essentially. And let me just, so here's this on click, I either want to sign in or I want to sign out. And those go up here and they use these built-in functions from NextAuth to make it really easy. Like it just gives you this entire thing completely pre-configured. You don't have to wire up any of this stuff yourself. So that's really convenient. And I think when I look back at rendering and data fetching in fast feedback, you'll notice I make really extensive use of client-side data fetching and showing loading states followed by that state resolving. So we see a loading skeleton here, then the data comes in. It's pretty much the same way for this in every other part of the application. I see a loading state here, then the data comes in. And overall, I think mostly some parts of this hold up. So the part of it that holds up is that showing loading states and loading skeletons is still a good pattern when done right. I think it can be over abused to have loading spinners everywhere, but it's nice to provide instant feedback that yes, something is happening. I'm loading some data and we're waiting for that to be completed. I think the difference is that in this model, I'm having to send all of that code to the client side. So what you actually end up doing is sending a lot of extra JavaScript just to handle basically the loading state and then resolving that loading state. So in the app directory, what's really interesting is it flips the default. The default is now to fetch things on the server. And when you're fetching things on the server, you can show an instant loading state and you can stream in the results. So for example, we have this loading file here. This loading file is going to be able to be displayed instantly from the server, and none of this code, none of the JavaScript here gets sent to the client. Basically, the only thing that gets sent to the client is the HTML. There's no client-side JavaScript needed to handle this component. In the pages directory in the Next.js 12, 11, 10 world, you would have needed to send the client-side JS for this to the browser. So that helps make your application faster while still giving you that same user experience of, I want to have a loading state that then resolves to fetching some data. And also the programming model of how I actually fetch that data is a lot more simplified, because now what you're saying is, here's my loading state. I showed this layout where I'm checking for auth. And then in the page, which is the index route. So that's another slight difference. In the pages directory, pages/index.js was the index route. In the app directory, the page file is what actually marks something as an addressable route, right? So app/page is the index route. Take a look at this code, because this is really, really interesting. I'm able to directly await Firebase db.collection.feedback.get. I'm able to grab the documents and iterate over them, grab the data for each document. I'm also pulling out the ID. This is just like a little quirk of Firebase, basically. But I'm able to get this array of documents from Firebase in 3 lines of code and fetch all of this in a server component. Again, none of this stuff gets sent to the client side. All of this evaluation happens on the server. I'm able to forward that data to a client component. So I'll go to this feedback table. Actually, sorry, this is a server component. So I'm able to forward all of that data from a server component to a server component, display a table of feedback, and it's all on the server. There's 0 client-side JS needed to display all of this data from Firebase, right? 0 client-side JS on top of what React and Next.js provide. So let me just start this up and we can kind of take a look and see what we're working with here. I'll start my dev server. I'm using PMPM here. Actually, meta note, but I would be using PMPM if I was starting from scratch as well too. I was not using PMPM 3 years ago. So again, this is not like a super polished thing. I just spit it out in a little bit of time, but it's just going to show I can actually get decently far using a couple different things with like half or maybe, a third of the code that I used to. I'm able to immediately see this loading state from the server. Again, it's not really pretty. It's just like a box here, but I could very easily turn this into a nice loading skeletons if I wanted to. That's all from the server. And then this entire page right now, everything but the nav bar is rendered entirely on the server from HTML, no client-side JS needed. It's only the interactive pieces up here at the top, AKA this little thing that allows me to sign in, that runs on the server. So I think that's really, really cool. I think that is just complete, like almost a completely different mental model than the way I was thinking about the world 3 years ago, because I didn't know that this was a thing that was going to happen with React. I didn't realize that you could just await some promise in your components and you would have this amazing async await support in React. That's been a huge innovation that's landed actually at the React level that I'm super, super excited about. And just to give context too, when this was 3 years ago, I wasn't working at Vercel either. I wasn't, working on the Next.js team. So now actually 3 years later, seeing all this stuff come to fruition has been very, very interesting to watch all of this progress happen. So very, very neat. Other than that, on rendering and data fetching, I think querying is half of the puzzle, but then the other half is actually mutating the data. So for mutating, I think that part of the puzzle is still a little bit left unsolved right now in the app directory as I'm looking at 2023, because with SWR, it made it really easy to not only, query your data on the client side because you could just do it in the component, but also mutate that data both for optimistic updates, just to make it, very, very seamless. So once Next.js addresses the mutation side of that, I think that we'll finally have, a much better solution for doing that on the client side. But it's interesting, I made a note here. One of the reasons why I think a lot of people went for this client-side data fetching solution is because it's very elegant and very easy and very appealing to co-locate your fetching directly with your components, right? So for example, this wasn't possible until very recently to just drop my data fetching directly in my page and then forward it along to components. The crazy thing here is that if I wanted to, I could actually take this, pull it out, and put it directly in the feedback table component and do the data fetching here if I wanted to. You have the complete flexibility of how you want to co-locate your fetches, how you want to structure your application for the best possible experience, and also really, really granular loading or error states. Maybe I want to have a completely different loading state for the table, and there's like a sidebar, and that one's going to have a different loading state. You can scale this up or down with the complexity of your layout, essentially. And previously, having to do all of that loading state yourself, you were having to kind of manually write in suspense boundaries or other ways of marking out which part of your UI was for loading. But with the built-in loading file, it's essentially giving you that automatically generated suspense boundary around your data fetching. So basically, to say rendering and data fetching has probably changed the most out of every single thing on this list from 3 years later, but in a very, very good and a very, very exciting way. Now let's talk about Next.js itself. So I think, picking Next.js 3 years ago was something that I already really loved. I wasn't working at Vercel yet, but I felt like this is something that is worth making more educational material on, teaching people about, because I think it's going to continue to grow into the future. Shortly after making the course, I ended up joining the team at Vercel and have been working on growing Next.js ever since then. So I'm really happy with that. And I think it has grown quite a bit in the last 3 years. I think there's a couple things that have held up really, really well. The first is one of the philosophies of Next.js is I have marketing pages, I have application pages, I have completely client-side only dashboards, I have dynamic server rendered pages, whatever I want to build. All of this can still be in the same application. I don't necessarily have to eject out of the tool if I want to do a different rendering strategy for one page. So for example, let's say, what you're looking at right here is effectively a single page application, right? This is like a hybrid single page application. The content is still pre-rendered from the server, but it's got those fast client-side transitions as I click around that makes it feel really snappy, right? But the pattern here is I'm doing the fetching on the client side, right? It's not a server rendered page. So we have that pattern. If I log out and I go back to the home page, this is a completely static marketing page. This is, generated to static. It's cached at edges all around the world when deployed to Vercel. And I can update this content periodically using ISR if I want, but I didn't have to eject and have a separate framework just for that thing. It's all part of kind of the same beast or the same entity. So not only can I configure the routing and rendering on a specific page level, it really allows you to not have to think about this breakdown between marketing pages and application pages as two separate things. Ultimately, what provides a much better product experience, in my opinion, because it's much more seamless to transition from I'm on the index page, I can actually pre-render and pre-fetch the next route, which is going to be going into the dashboard. And when I click on it, it's really, really fast versus I'm sure we've all seen the experience where you click on a button to take you actually into the application. It pops open in like a separate subdomain. It feels really clunky or slow. You can actually avoid that problem entirely and have it be really fast because with Next.js in code splitting by default, you're only going to load the JS for the index route when you hit the index route, unless there are specific pieces that are shared between multiple pages, like a nav bar or a footer or other pieces like that. Another thing that I did that I thought was interesting 3 years ago was I used MDX as well too. So down at the bottom, we have privacy terms, some docs, which this is like telling people, hey, here's how you use the thing. We have some terms and conditions. We have a privacy policy, all of these things. I didn't really want to build all this out myself. I just wanted to write it in Markdown, and maybe that Markdown's in my repo. Maybe it's in a database. It doesn't really matter, I guess. But the nice thing about this is the way MDX works 3 years ago and Next.js is pretty much still the same today, with the caveat of you're also able to do MDX completely on the server side in the app directory, which is new. And I think if I was rebuilding this today, that's probably the route I would go. Now, to be fair, we haven't really talked about this very much yet, and there aren't very many examples yet. But I think thinking from now until the rest of 2023, there will certainly be more that we talk about around MDX in the app directory. But MDX is still a good choice if you want to do React components inside of your content, essentially. There's also a couple things that I chose in the Next.js realm that were kind of ecosystem tools or things that we were able to use ecosystem packages for, like Next SEO, and I had this like wrapper around logging. I think it was a structured logging tool, right? And I used that to dump logs to Logflare. These worked really, really well, and I think there's pros and cons of this. But what we're starting to see is kind of similar to the way that the React ecosystem was, kind of unopinionated about some things. And then eventually over time, as the patterns stabilized or patterns were kind of figured out, then the great ideas got some revisions and they actually got built into the core. So like data fetching, right? Now you can do async components in React, and that's a primitive of React itself, along with server components. It took some time to figure out exactly how to do that, but it has now landed. Kind of similar thing with Next.js in how we want to handle SEO or the metadata around SEO, how we want to think about logging. We're definitely thinking about both of these two things and helping to bring these things both back into the core library itself, and we'll talk about that more in the future. But I think the thing here is that what the really good ideas essentially stabilize into the frameworks or tools themselves. And I think that's super powerful. So I guess the question is, would I still pick Next.js today, even though we've seen a ton of innovation in the framework market as well too? There's a bunch of new solutions, even in the last year, kind of all with their own take on things. I'm obviously, of course, biased because I work with Next.js every day, but I would still pick it, trying to be as unbiased as I can because of what I talked about earlier. It gives me the flexibility to make the best choice, not only for my marketing pages, but for my logged in pages, for my server rendered pages. I can do all of that in the same app. I don't have to necessarily eject out to do different things. Now, does that mean it's the right solution for every app or every person? No, not necessarily, but I'm still personally happy with it. So I would continue still to use it. So let's talk about styling. You might have noticed that the styling here looks a little bit different than what it used to. Just to put it into perspective, what I'll do here is I'll log in back to here. So the goal with this original app was, well, there was two things. One, I wanted to show people the process of like, hey, I have some designs in Figma. How do I actually take those designs and turn them into code? So we use Shocker UI here, and overall, like it worked pretty well for the course, teaching people kind of how to break things down into components, how to effectively co-locate your styling with your component. Because you could do, maybe just to show an example here, you can do a lot of your transformations on how you want to style something on the component itself. So we have this box, it's got a background color, it's using a system of gray.100. We've got a flex component. It's got different styling based on the different viewports. So there's less on mobile. Like this, I think this all looks, it doesn't look too foreign, I think, for a lot of people. Like, I think this makes sense intuitively, kind of what I'm looking at here. And what it ended up with was something like this, which is an artisanally crafted dashboard that works just for what I was trying to build. Now, looking at this 3 years later, this is a pretty basic dashboard, right? Like this is a list, and then if I click on here, there's another list of things. I have this list. It's like another list of all the feedback essentially, and it's got some toggles. Like there's nothing super innovative here. Well, in the last 3 years, a couple things have happened. One, Tailwind CSS has gotten way better, way faster, and it's now my default tool that I build pretty much everything with. I can definitely get more into why that, but also there is Tremor, which is a component library tool that makes it really easy to build dashboards. And when I say dashboards, I mean the type of designs that we were building before that have tables or lists or charts, stuff that you just want to drop in some data and just see something that looks really appealing, right? And it's built on Tailwind and it's built on React. So I'm able to get these really, really nice, fancy dashboards without really having to do pretty much anything. It kind of all just works. So to see a quick comparison here, maybe I'll just pull this up side by side. I mean, it's not like the design on the left is miles better than the design on the right. And it took me about a third of the time to build, probably less than that, a third of the time to build the design on the right with a lot less custom code. And I still get a really nice table that I can just drop some stuff in. So yeah, Tremor's free. It's really amazing. Just to actually show what this looks like, I can go back to that code I had pulled up earlier, which is table. I'm able to import all these different table components from Tremor. I define my type of the feedback that I get back from Firebase. I pass in this data from my server component, and this is all it takes to render my table. And because it's built on Tailwind, I can still eject out, essentially, quote unquote, and use other Tailwind classes when I want. Like, for example, the feedback here, it can be really long. So I said, put a max width on it and truncate it. Put those ellipses, and it was that easy. I didn't have to I didn't have to wait for the component library to support some specific prop variant that I wanted to do. I can just have full flexibility to really do whatever I want. It just gives me a lot of these really nice building blocks to do this stuff. So if I go back to here, and let's say I go back to, I think there's, let's see, feedback table. So the way I had built this before, I'm using kind of similar type things. There were helpers that I had built, like table, TR, that were essentially just wrappers around the styles that I wanted. And then the feedback row is where I had a little bit more of the components. So we have feedback table header. What's this one look like? I'm using some of the breadcrumbs. Okay. Feedback row. Again, I'm using like boxes and switch. And yeah, I mean, it's okay. But one thing you'll notice here, the allure of this is doing the use auth directly in the component is extremely, extremely nice. I want to check if I'm auth, and if I'm auth, I want to do something different. And like I said previously, the easiest way to do this was with client-side JS and traditional client-side patterns. But in the app directory with server components, it does make this so much easier. So would recommend checking out Tremor. If I was building this again today, which is what I've kind of just built here for fun, I would definitely use Tremor. It's made it super easy. I actually even rebuilt the account page. It gives you these nice cards that allow you to just put in whatever you want, how much feedback I've used, if I want to go out to the billing page. The other thing I guess I would talk about in respect to styling that maybe didn't age as well as I wanted it to was CSS-in-JS. Specifically runtime CSS-in-JS. So style components, emotion, and the gang, essentially. All of these solutions, I don't want to get, people feel very strongly about this. Here's my hot take. Runtime CSS-in-JS was a bad idea. I drank the Kool-Aid. I thought it was a really good idea. It seemed really helpful, but looking back 3 years now, I don't think I would have chosen that same thing now because there can be a lot of negative effects of choosing that. You can add more client-side JS. It can be incompatible with some of the newer ways of doing things, like being able to stream in content initially from the server without, potentially some hacks. I guess the only other thing on styling is that I would definitely choose Tailwind in 2023. I know that's a contentious take lately, I guess, but I think the thing for me with Tailwind is what's really fun is when I revisit projects that I built. I started really using Tailwind a lot, like two years ago. Now, when I look back on things 2 years ago, I can instantly jump in and I just know basically exactly what's going on. I'm already familiar with all the classes. Everything kind of just makes sense. And in some cases, even where I had still ejected out to vanilla CSS, it still just makes a lot of sense and is very maintainable. So I'm pretty happy with my multi-year bet on Tailwind at this point. It's not for everybody, I guess. Like some people will see that loading, even just this right here, they'll see this and they'll say like, ugh, that's a lot of class names. I don't really like that. But for me, it's better than the alternatives, I guess. There's never going to be one that's perfectly great, but I feel like it's definitely better than the alternatives. So other than styling, the last one that I had written down that I think is interesting to talk about is a little bit more of a meta note on the industry as a whole. Because I remember the period of like 2015 to 2020, even, let's say like those 5 years, it felt like the tooling kept changing and changing and changing in a way where like the best tool or the recommended tool kept getting changed. I remember the first course that I did when I was even recommending what tool I wanted to use for linting or formatting, like Prettier wasn't even the main thing yet. And even for ESLint, like a lot of people were talking about standard.js, which is like another solution. But now looking at 2023, like ESLint and Prettier are pretty much like well agreed upon tools. A lot of this churn has slowed down in the ecosystem where people have kind of decided, you know what, ESLint is good. TypeScript is good. Prettier is good. There's been more competition in the things that haven't been as figured out yet, like the frameworks and the libraries, the component libraries. Like that stuff is still seeing a lot of innovation, and there isn't necessarily a standard tool. But at least in the terms of Next.js, it has been nice that 3 years later I can kind of update and I can still do things exactly the way I did 3 years ago if I want to. I don't necessarily have to build things in this brand new way that I just talked about with the app directory and these new patterns. I certainly can, but I don't have to. And I think that's a nice change of pace, I think, from the 5 years of despair, 10 years of despair of JS tooling, trying to figure things out. I see there's some other comments about why some people don't like Tailwind. There's a comment around like the long class names or style components. They often see the implementation of that going wrong, where people use the same flexbox div in 45 components. And it's funny because it's actually, it like your brain thinks that you're doing it right when you're doing it wrong. And what I mean by that is like, take a look at this. Let's say I use this box component here, or I use a flex component because I'm just trying to use the abstractions that a CSS-in-JS tool might provide. What I don't realize is that each one of these is unique. There isn't like a deduplication that's happening to where if I do a new box here that's got one permutation of the styles, that this isn't going to dedupe down to just only one instance. If I go back to the feedback table, I think there was one place where I was doing a flex. Maybe it was in the row. Empty state. Here's flex, right? So like, look at this. And then let me do this. I'll just do like export function test Tailwind. I love when this happens when VS Code, and I don't actually like put the extension and VS Code just kind of guesses at what I'm doing. But the only reason I was going to do this is because I just wanted to show the equivalency here. And maybe what I can do is I could even, well, whatever, I'll just leave it like this. Okay, so look on the left and look at this flex. Now, I think this is going to be this one unique instance of flex, but really, every single time I do this, I'm adding more client-side JS because I need to use this thing. The equivalent in the Tailwind world would be flex, width full, background white, border, I guess border, I'm not sure which border radius it would be. I think it's border radius like that. Padding 4, justify center, align, center, flex, call. Like, I think that's, yeah, it's rounded. It's not border radius. Good call. Chat knows better. And rounded like medium maybe for 8 pixels. Now, here's the big difference. This actually does get deduped. So if I do this same exact set of class names 3,000 places in my code base, and I compile this thing for prod, I'm only ever using 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 different CSS selectors, right? That's a huge difference in terms of performance. And also in the case of runtime CSS-in-JS libraries, the amount of client-side JS that gets shipped. Now, I don't want to broad strokes paint over every single CSS-in-JS solution because there are some that don't have runtime JS. And I think some of them might be intelligent enough to dedupe that a little bit, but I'm not sure about the latter, but at least the former, there are some that still compile down to a CSS sheet. So specifically runtime JS, I think, is one of the tricky things here. Is there a convention to abstract those class names out of the JSX? There is a ESLint / Prettier. Whoa, that's super. ESLint / Prettier extension that will it's by the Tailwind team. It's the official one. It will reformat these in a consistent pattern. I don't remember exactly what the pattern is, but it puts like one set of classes first after another. So they're always kind of in the same format. In terms of like, let's say I had, this many class names and you're like, wow, this is terrible. I never want to look at this. The recommendation is actually to take advantage of the framework's component model itself, whether it's React or Vue or Svelte or whatever, and break these into individual pieces. Now, there certainly will be times where you still might have really long class name strings. There is a VS Code extension as well too that will like collapse this down to basically this, and then you can click on it and expand it if you want. I personally am fine with seeing the class names. I think maybe I'm just immune to the disease, but I've gotten used to it and I don't necessarily mind it. I see there's a question about obfuscating the Tailwind class names. I'm curious what the intention behind that is. I see somebody saying they tried to hash the classes with post CSS, but I couldn't make it work. I don't know if that's just to not allow people to see what styling you're doing or what the intention is there, but I think, it might be possible. I tried to make the HTML. Oh, I see what you're saying. Yeah. I'm not sure. That's a good question, actually, because then, actually, what's interesting is let's say you had all of these classes. What you actually don't want to do, from the recommendation of Tailwind is you don't want to do this. You don't want to pull all of these and call this button. And then in your CSS sheet somewhere, in your CSS sheet somewhere, you don't want to actually just do something like this. And I think it's at apply. You don't want to do something like this most of the time because now you're kind of back into the same situation that you were where you're having to come up with names. Now I had to come up with this name of this class. And that's part of the problem that Tailwind completely abstracts for you. Now, there are one-off cases where you might want to do this, but this is largely not needed when you embrace a framework, a React, a Vue, a Svelte, or whatever that have the component-based model. So I've kind of just gotten used to this and tried to take care of the tools that I have. On other tooling, a couple other smaller ones would be Logflare was acquired by Superbase, which is Superbase, which is kind of cool. It's nice to see them, have a good ending to their team there. And I think the service is still running as well too. I think they just have new ownership. So that's cool. And also 3 years ago, I didn't use TypeScript very much. I wasn't very good with it. Honestly, I'm still not very good with it, let's be honest. But it's enough for me to take the plunge and go with the adoption of the ecosystem. And if I was rebuilding this again today, I would go TypeScript first by default. That's actually what I've started to do in this rebuilt example here, just because you can actually get a lot for free with very minimal typing. I think this is actually one of the best parts about TypeScript for me, especially TypeScript and React and Next.js, is I make all these files TSX, and honestly, I can kind of sprinkle in types as I need, but even just doing little things wrong, I didn't really have to write very much TypeScript specific code here. I gave this one type and I said that the child is a React node, right? And I still get a ton of value from my editor here just by making this a .tsx file. So you don't even have to be a TypeScript wizard to get value from doing TypeScript. And you can even loosen up your settings in your TS config too if you want to have, more loose types. I know that some of the TypeScript experts will be like, no, don't allow any restriction of the types. But for people who are just getting started, I think that's actually one of the biggest benefits to TypeScript is that you can really like incrementally fine tune the types and lock it down as much or as little as you want. So I find that very refreshing, actually. It's very nice. All right, so hopefully that gives you a better understanding of the decisions I would make today in 2023 versus 3 years ago when I first made the course, both in databases and authentication and styling and more. If you want to see more content like this, give me a subscribe, leave a comment down below, and let me know what you'd like to see. Thanks for watching.